All right, so next up is our stem stitch. I've gone back to my 3 strands. Just because I jumped up here to 4 strands doesn't mean that you have to. I'm going to do it with the stem stitch too. It's just to show you both tutorials so that you can decide, and then you'll apply whichever you like most to each. So for the stem stitch, we have 2 options. So I'm going to start with the first, and then I will work on the second after in 4 strands. So we're going to come up down through the thread, and then before we close this loop here, which you can go down as far as you want, you just have to make sure that you can still come up. I'm going to come up halfway through that loop and then pull it closed. So you're creating like an overlapping stitch. And so, oops, just pull that out and straighten it out. And then for the second stitch, I come all the way back to the original to create this overlapping stitch. It kind of creates like a rolling, almost like a whipped back stitch. And one of the tricks that I use is I always pull. I sometimes will have to, if I'm feeling that it's not sitting as flat when I'm doing this, I pull from the side. Instead of pulling from this side where it's pulling it over, I will pull to just try to make sure that I get the one thread nice and tight after I've come up. There's obviously a stitch underneath of it, so sometimes it doesn't want to. Like if I'm pulling from here, see how it's not quite flush? If I pull from here, it comes down a little bit further. So it's just to try to get it as tight, and the tension, that's the part that I struggle with the most with this version, is the tension. So I like to make sure I'm giving it that extra tug to just keep the tension nice and tight. And you can do as long of stitches as you want, or you can do them even shorter than this to tighten up your stitches. It's just, you can experiment with different stitch lengths, even in the same like row. You can tighten up your stitches to see what it looks like. You don't have to keep them all the same length. It's an experiment practice sampler, so if you want to try different sizes just so you can see what it looks like, that's an option too, or you can change it up for each row, or you can keep it all consistent. That's your prerogative for this pattern. Those are all things that will help you get the most out of how this pattern works. Okay. And then I've got about a half stitch here, so I'm just going to come down to finish it. All right, so we're going to do our stem stitch in 4 strands doubled up, and I'm going to show you the second option for the stem stitch. I sometimes call this the lazy stem stitch, not because it's actually lazy, but because I think it's easier, and in that process, you do take a little bit more thread. So it's very similar to the way we do the split stitch, where the 2 split stitch options. We're just doing what I consider a little bit less finicky of an option. So we're going to do it, instead of coming up through, we're going to do the same thing we did before as a back stitch, like the split stitch, but instead of splitting the strands, we're going beside them. The same as instead of coming up between the stitches, we're coming up, going back and coming up through the stitches, or coming up back through the side, we're going backwards. So they're honestly identical. Like this method and this method are the same. This one you're splitting, this one you're going on the one side, and this one you're stitching back through, and this one you're stitching down through back through the side. So the same thing with the second option for the stem stitch is you're using more thread, but I do find I'm able to be, sometimes I find it easier. It takes more thread, and I don't have to hold that thread. I don't need 2 hands for this option. So it really is what you're more comfortable with. I think a lot of people only teach one version. A lot of people only use one version. I normally start with one version for people to learn instead of introducing both. But the whole premise of this sampler kit is to give you as much information The one thing I like about this version is that I don't have to worry about that tension quite as much, like I was saying about pulling the strands down. They're already nice and tight because there was nothing in the way. I find they do look slightly different when they're finished, and sometimes that's just how far I space my stitches. Because they're different techniques, I find the way I stitch them comes out a little bit different. But they should look quite similar. Okay, I'm actually going to squeeze in 2 stitches at the end here instead of just doing one long one. All right, and then we finish the same way, we just do one last stitch.